Welcome. This is one of over 200 talks on the history of Western art, and I've arranged these talks chronologically. I start with cave art and work through to the present day. This is section 27 on Impressionism, and this is talk number 4 on Edgar Degas. I've included him with the Impressionists, even though he didn't consider himself an Impressionist. He didn't paint out of doors, for example, and he used to call himself a realist or simply an independent. This is Degas. He was born Hilaire Zerman Edgar Degas. The last name, his surname, was 2 words. He was born into a fairly wealthy family in Paris, and the prefix de signified a noble family. But Degas thought it pretentious, particularly as his family didn't have aristocratic ancestors. His father was a banker and had connections in Italy and New Orleans, and his mother was a former ballet dancer. So when he left home, he simplified his name to Edgar Degas. Now, as a child, his health was poor. His mother had to look after him, and he was fascinated from an early age with art and with drawing. And his father encouraged it. He used to take him to museums. Nevertheless, he had a strict bourgeois upbringing. He had to formally study 5 or 6 hours every day, and his family wanted him to become a lawyer, and he actually began law studies in the autumn of 1853. But 2 years later, he was introduced to the famous 73-year-old artist Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres, and Degas by then revered Ingres. And Ingres told him, "Draw lines, young man, and still more lines, both from life and from memory, and you will become a good artist." Degas took his advice to heart. He studied under a student of Ingres. He enrolled at the École des Beaux-Arts to study drawing, and a year later he travelled to Italy to further his study of art, and he actually stayed there 3 years copying Renaissance artists. He venerated Ingres all his life. He never described himself as an Impressionist, as he believed, like Ingres, in the primacy of line over colour. This is the Bellelli family, and it shows his aunt Laura, her husband Baron Gennaro Bellelli, and their 2 daughters Giulia and Giovanna. It's a unique composition, an unusual composition. It's a subtle portrayal, I think, of domestic tension. The family is shown in separate physical spaces and separate psychological spaces, reflecting his study of individual personalities. He created this work over several years during his travels in Italy. He sketched the figures individually and then assembled them into this final composition in his studio, a technique that he often used. He would make many sketches, but then do the work either with oil paints or pastels in his studio. Note the distance between the husband and wife, with the Baron physically and so appearing emotionally separated from his family. His aunt is shown in mourning dress. Her father had recently died. In fact, it's his portrait hanging on the wall behind her. Note that the aunt and the children are not looking at the Baron, who appears, in fact, to be sitting in a fireplace. It's an early masterpiece. Degas was in his late 20s. It shows the influence of the realist movement with its subdued palette and unconventional grouping of figures. This is young Spartans exercising. In fact, one of his most intriguing history paintings. It's based on Plutarch's account of Lycurgus, the legendary Spartan lawgiver, who instituted physical training and wrestling contests where girls were commanded to challenge the boys and sometimes even exercise nude. There was an unusual degree of sexual equality in ancient Greek society in Sparta. Although, of course, Sparta was incredibly harsh society. Boys were completely removed from their family at the age of 7 to undergo constant, brutal treatment to turn them into warriors. Now, women had more freedom than in other ancient Greek states, but they still, even in Sparta, they couldn't vote, they couldn't hold public office. Their sole role was to produce strong, healthy children. And the Spartans believed that one of the ways of achieving this was to educate the girls and to get them to engage in a lot of physical activity, which is what you see going on here. Degas was fascinated by classical tradition and the social behaviours at the time, which is reflected here. The adolescent girls perhaps are taunting their male counterparts, and in the background you can see a group of older women with Lycurgus talking to them and watching. And in the distance, the harsh mountains of Sparta remind us of the city's brutal customs. Now, the theme, I guess, is athletic competition and female agency. But art historians have long pointed out that Degas has actually modernised the faces and the postures. Although he originally modelled them on ideal Greek beauty, he reworked this painting over many years, and the figures came to resemble contemporary Parisian youth, one critic even describing them as street urchins of Montmartre. And X-rays reveal that he obsessively repainted the figures, changing their position slightly and the number of figures. And that ends up, if you look below the girls, you have an anatomical impossibility. If you count them, there's actually 10 legs among the 4 bodies. A legacy, I think, of his endless revisions and reworking and his lack of concern for strict realism. He's produced a scene that is full of energy, but becomes a bit awkward on close examination. And it's not clear. You could interpret this as a group of girls taunting their male counterparts. Are they taunting them to fight? Or is it some sort of flirtatious ritual? It was listed for the 1880 Impressionist exhibition, but he never displayed it publicly. He kept it in his studio. Perhaps he thought it was too controversial a subject matter. This was created when he was still focused on traditional history subjects. That is, before he became known for his Impressionist paintings of contemporary life. And he did submit this to the Salon in Paris in 1865. It was accepted, but largely overlooked. There isn't a lot of critical comment about it. And it's generally considered his last history painting, if you can call it a history painting. It's been known by multiple titles. I've titled it here, Scene of War in the Middle Ages. It's been called The Misfortunes of the City of Orleans. It doesn't show any specific historical battle. It's a brutal war scene. There's naked women being harassed by mounted soldiers. It's a frieze-like arrangement. But it's ambiguous because there's no specific historical incident that fits this scene. The women are unaccountably nude. They're pursued by armed horsemen. It almost suggests a surreal allegory rather than an intent to realistically depict the scene. Some critics later have interpreted this as an allegory of the violence suffered by women in New Orleans during the American Civil War, following what's called the Women Act of General Butler the year before this was painted in 1862. We don't know. It's New Orleans, of course, as we'll see later, is closely linked to Degas' maternal family. The scene, I mean, it's extremely brutal, but it's oddly calmed. The mounted soldiers aim arrows, but the 9 terrified female nudes appear more like studio models than tragic victims. It's almost as if he's sketched each figure separately and then assembled them together in the painting. The horses are stirrupless. The weaponry is historically inaccurate. So many see this as a sort of strange theatrical fantasy, a sort of deliberately constructed scene where violence is ritualized and the landscape looks more like a stage. The critics that did comment on it were shocked. Some of them were fascinated by the meticulous preparation that had gone into it, and others commented on the immodest poses, maybe foreshadowing his future focus on bathing women in everyday scenes. But the painting soon faded from the public eye. It marked, as I said, his break with history subjects, and he turned towards contemporary life. Ballet dances, racetracks, urban Paris became the subject of his later paintings. This is one of his first paintings to focus on the ballet. It depicts Eugénie Fiocre, who was a celebrated ballerina. She's playing a role as Princess Norida in the ballet La Source. And what we see here are 3 women and a horse. There's a pool of water. It's a lush theatrical setting. Fiocre is seated at the water's edge, gazing into the reflective pool, and she's accompanied by her companion and attendant. And the reflection adds another dimension. It's actually a backstage, and so it's not a performance. It's showing the stillness backstage, and you can tell that if you look between the legs of the horse, you'll see her discarded ballet slippers, and you'll notice her bare feet dabbling in the water. She was principal ballerina at the Paris Opera. She was famed for her beauty and for dancing en travesti. That's she performed male roles, and she created the role of France in the ballet Coppelia. And rather than show her performing, he's captured her in this contemplative behind the scenes moment during a rehearsal. The production itself was elaborate. It did feature a live horse. It featured elaborate sets and costumes, and even a hydraulically powered stream, which all appear in this painting. So he's merging this theatrical artifice with psychological realism. This is one of his most enigmatic and unsettling works. The subject matter's deliberately obscure, I think. It generated intense debate amongst critics and viewers at the time, and there's no clear literary or historical source. Some early viewers and friends of Degas called it le viol, the rape, and for decades it was widely interpreted as depicting the aftermath or threat of sexual violence, possibly a scene of rape or coercion at least. There's details like the woman's rumpled dress, the rigid bed, the small hints like a splash of red, all leading weight to the reading. Others speculated on marital discord or emotional violence. Now, some of his friends say that he used the name Le Viol, of the rape, but others say he was incensed, annoyed by its widespread use, and he preferred the more general interior. Well, he exhibited it as interior in 1905, and in a notebook he referred to it simply as my genre picture. When it finally exhibited in 1905, the critics were divided. They all thought it was extraordinarily theatrical. The figures are posed like actors. There's dramatic lighting. There's household objects laid out as if on a stage. But it's ambiguous, and it left audiences unsettled and fascinated. There's a man on the right standing threateningly, I think, with his back against a closed door, almost as if he's blocking the exit. There's a woman sitting hunched and defeated on the other side of the room. There's a crimson-lined sewing box lying open on the table. Some interpret it as a symbol of violated secrets. It's illuminated by a single lamp on the table, casting deep shadows and dramatically highlighting the figures. And this contrast, this artificial light, creating these strong contrasts, create this intimate and suspenseful atmosphere. The bed is prominent, but it remains untouched. There's a discarded corset on the floor, hinting at domestic disturbance or even violence. For over a century now, art historians have tried to find its meaning, and let me just suggest a few of the meanings that have been suggested. Some say it's based on a Zola novel. It's a widely accepted theory that it illustrates a scene from Émile Zola's 1867 novel Thérèse Raquin, and the scene is thought to be the traumatic wedding night of Thérèse and her accomplice Laurent after they have murdered her first husband. Another theory suggests it's a depiction of a prostitute and her client in a hotel room, possibly following sexual violence. And this aligns with as evidence, people have brought forward this Paul Giovanni's 1841 lithograph of Les Laurettes, the type of Parisian courtesan, featuring a similar in some ways composition, and that is definitely showing a prostitute or a courtesan. There are other readings. Some focus on the scene as a depiction of marital dissatisfaction, power dynamics, a psychological conflict, an argument, if you like, between husband and wife. But there's no single interpretation that's universally accepted, which I think illustrates the power of the painting. It creates an unsettling atmosphere with no concrete explanation, allowing us to project our own feelings and understanding onto the scene. This is orchestra musicians, sometimes called the orchestra at the opera. It's an unusual composition because Degas is in the orchestra pit, a perspective not typically explored in art. The musicians fill the foreground. Only the cropped legs of the ballerinas are seen on stage. The musicians, incidentally, are Degas' friends. The bassoonist, prominently shown in the centre, is Désiré Déo, a friend of Degas and who commissioned the painting. Degas also included other friends in the orchestra, such as the composer Émile Chabrier. It's an early example of his interest in opera and ballet and his shift away from history paintings. And of course, depictions of ballet dancers would become a defining part of his later genre, his later work. This is the Cotton Office. I mentioned earlier his family was associated with New Orleans. It did have ties to slavery. Degas' brothers, René and Achille, ran an import-export business called Degas Brothers, and their uncle, Michel Mousson, was a partner in a separate cotton firm, and after the American Civil War, René joined his uncle's business. And the family was therefore directly involved in the institution of slavery in New Orleans. They were involved in the cotton trade that depended heavily on enslaved labour, and members of the Mousson and the Degas family owned slaves and were significant players within the Confederate supporting elite of Louisiana. Degas' mother, Celestine Mousson, came from a wealthy Creole family in New Orleans, whose wealth was partly augmented by the sale of enslaved people. In fact, a young slave girl was sold to contribute to her dowry. Now, Degas visited New Orleans in 1872, and the portrait he painted during this time include this work, The Cotton Office. He stayed 5 months. He lived with his maternal Creole family. He wrote letters describing the city's black world in explicitly racist and dehumanizing terms. As I said, his relatives were involved in the cotton trade and in fact were part of the local white supremacist community. Although unknown to Degas, his maternal grandfather was, the family had mixed race relatives, and one of them was a prominent inventor. The connection wasn't discovered until much later by scholars. This shows the office, the Cotton Office. His uncle, Michel Mousson, is the one in the foreground towards the left of centre, examining cotton. Degas' brother René is the one behind reading a newspaper, and his other brother Achille is the one leaning back against the open window. And other employees are engaged in various business operations throughout the office. He's used this odd off-centred perspective. He's placed us in the corner of the room. There's a strong beam of light illuminating the scene from the left. It's noted for its realism and detail and was exhibited in the Impressionist exhibition of 1875. It was the first painting by Degas, and in fact the first by any Impressionist, to be acquired by a public museum. And this was a major step forward for Degas and helped towards stabilising the finances for the artist. Important, as we'll see later. After he returned to Paris, he discovered that his brothers René and Achille had accumulated large debts connected with their cotton brokerage business. And to preserve the family reputation and financial stability, he sold his house and he sold his entire inherited art collection and paid off his brother's debts. But the financial strain was pivotal because it forced Degas, for the first time, to rely on the income from his sale of his art. And so getting accepted, being purchased by a museum, helped towards establishing him and helped towards creating a more predictable income from the sale of his art. And in fact, this period after 1874 coincided with his highest artistic productivity, and he became a key figure in Impressionism. This is ballet rehearsal, and he's chosen a high viewpoint to one side. We see the rehearsal in progress. In the foreground, the ballerinas are resting, one sitting on the bench. In the background, they are practicing movements together. The paint is thin, so we can see Degas reworking. For example, bottom left, you can see the ballerinas' feet have been moved, and also the sort of in the middle on the right, near the seated man, there was another figure collapsed in a chair, which he painted out, but you can just make it out through the thin paint. It was noticed when it was exhibited at the first Impressionist exhibition of 1874. In fact, another painter wrote to a friend, quote, "I remember a drawing that must have been of a dance rehearsal, and I can tell you it was extremely beautiful. The muslin costumes were so diaphanous and the movements so true to life that it has to be seen to be believed. It's just impossible to describe." End quote. Incidentally, he calls it a drawing. It was seen as a drawing, although because of its subtle, delicate tones. Now, Degas produced about 150 paintings, pastels, focused on ballet classes, rehearsals and performances. He in his lifetime, he produced roughly 600 paintings, 1,200 drawings and pastels, hundreds of sculptures and prints. So, in other words, ballet was a major subject for him. So what I thought I would do is show you two similar works to illustrate the sort of volume of work that he was producing. Both these works are called The Dance Class, both produced the same year, and there's you can see subtle differences between them. There's some 24 women shown, ballerinas, and if you look at the back, their mothers. Their mothers are waiting while a dancer, particularly you see this on the right, she's executing an attitude for her examination. An attitude in ballet is a classical dance position where dancers stand on one leg while the other leg is lifted and bent at the knee, usually at about 90-degree angle. And she is being judged by Jules Perrault, who was a famous ballet master. It's an imaginary scene set in a rehearsal room in the old Paris Opera. On the wall behind there's a mirror, there's a poster advertising Rossini's William Tell, and it pays tribute to the singer Jean-Baptiste Fauré, who commissioned the picture and lent it to the 1876 Impressionist exhibition. Now, Degas wasn't just fascinated by the movement of dancers, he was also intrigued by the repetitive specialist gestures made by laundresses and ironers, who often worked in grueling conditions. This is the first of 3 versions of this composition. You can see the dramatic chiaroscuro. The woman is silhouetted against a luminous white backdrop. It was bought by the singer and collector Jean-Baptiste Fauré, who I just mentioned, and it was returned to Degas so he could rework it. The artist kept the picture, lent it to the 1876 Impressionist exhibition, where it received praise for his rapidly done silhouettes of laundresses. Now, laundresses were amongst the poorest women in Paris, They received extremely low wages for difficult and exhausting work, and they were also regarded as morally suspect, partly because they delivered clean clothes to the apartments of wealthy gentlemen. Degas' interest here is in capturing the physicality and rhythm of their work rather than making a comment on the social position of these women. It conforms, of course, with the Impressionist interest in everyday subjects. Of course, it's a solitary figure rather than a social scene which the Impressionists often painted. And critics admired how Degas has elevated the mundane to create this dignified subject. This is Lady with a Dog. One of the reasons I'm showing you this painting, which is now in Norway, is because Degas was famous for his hatred of dogs. Although, of course, he did paint this one, but normally if somebody had a dog, they had to be locked away before he arrived. And as the years passed, he lost friends, he became isolated, he never married, and he actually believed an artist could not have a personal life. An artist had to focus on their art 100%. This is The Star, L'Étoile, and it captures a ballerina taking a bow on a brightly lit stage. It's viewed from a high vantage point, a private box, and it gives us a privileged perspective looking down on the stage, which creates this sense of immediacy and draws us into the performance. It's pastel, so there's a soft atmospheric atmosphere and colour, vibrant light effects. Pastel paintings were much in demand in Paris. In fact, they were more in demand than oil paintings. They were fashionable. He's created this with visible, rapid strokes of the pigment, leading to this sense of movement in the work. There could, of course, be, some have seen sombre undertones. Notice on the left, there's a dark figure of a man lurking behind the curtain, seen to represent the ballet's seedy backstage reality, where dancers were often dependent on male patrons for their financial security, and patrons took advantage of their position of power. Now, Degas actually produced many sculptures. He was a secretive sculptor. He was famous for his paintings and drawings, and he, behind the scenes, worked producing sculptures. But he used whatever materials were to hand. He worked primarily in wax and clay. He modelled figures typically of dancers and horses, and he never intended any of these works to be publicly viewed. He would use wine bottle corks, old floorboards. He would use brushes to create armatures, that is the structure underlying, and then he would bulk out the figures with wax and clay. We know this because the ones that remain, like this one, Little Dancer, age 14, have been x-rayed, so we can see the odd brushes and pieces of equipment that make up the armature underneath it. Now, after his death, there were some 150 sculptures like this found in his studio, and his heirs authorised their casting in bronze, which is the way we see many of his sculptures today. The only sculpture he ever exhibited in his lifetime was this one, little dancer, age 14, shown at the 1881 Impressionist exhibition, and it was reviled by many critics. It was too startlingly realistic for them, and they didn't like the mixed media, the wax. And in fact, he used real tulle skirt and a human hair wig, and this wasn't acceptable. This wasn't normal. The model for this sculpture is a ballerina in training, Maria van Gotham, who was then just 14. She lived near Degas, and she has here what you could call a defiant pose and expression. It was marked, various comments were made by critics. I won't read them all. One was flower of precocious depravity. Another was a face marked by the hateful promise of every vice. My thinking is that the critics were just projecting their own thoughts onto this young ballerina. He created two notable works entitled The Tub, and this is a pastel drawing, perhaps it was the best known, from 1886, and later he produced this sculpture, 1888 to 9. Both pieces depict a woman bathing in a shallow tub. They're housed now in separate museums. Originally, the sculpture was mixed media. He used dark red beeswax, plaster for the water, and a real sponge and a lead basin, but after his death it was cast in bronze. The pastel shows a woman bent over a zinc bathtub. It's viewed from an unconventional elevated perspective, sometimes called blown off roof perspective, a technique inspired by Japanese art, and it gives us this intimate, almost voyeuristic look into a private moment. The toilet articles are on a shelf and appear flattened, contrasting with the curves of the figure and the tub. This was one of a series of bathing nudes that Degas exhibited in the final Impressionist exhibition of 1886, and it was a departure from traditional nude art. It typically featured idealized mythical figures, the traditional art, like Venus. Instead, Degas focuses on this unglamorous, everyday acts of real women. He has been described as misogynistic. Some see his nudes as objectifying women and his brothel scenes as prurient, but other critics find empathy in his intimate, unidealized renderings of working women. This is the second of two variants of a composition he created about 1885. The other one is in the Hermitage in St. Petersburg. He used a new technique of applying pastels. He applied them layer after layer of the pastel crayon to the extent that the fibres of the paper were loosened and now project up from the surface almost like hair. Difficult to see in this reproduction. He also here is emphasising this anti-natural chartreuse and greens modelling the figure's pink flesh. Perhaps he was inspired by the use of complementary colour contrasts being used by young artists like Seurat and Van Gogh. And I should at this point mention his other interest. He was a keen photographer, and it's thought he took up photography to compensate for his failing eyesight, and he often painted from photographs. And I'm showing you one example here that's in the Jean-Paul Getty Museum. His eyesight started to deteriorate in the 1880s, and he took lots of photographs. He created portraits of friends. He liked to use lamplight to avoid harsh daylight. He considered daylight too easy and preferred the atmospheric challenge of artificial light. He also photographed dancers and nude women, as you see here, as studies for his paintings and sculptures. As I said, he never married. As he got older, he became more argumentative. His eyesight was deteriorating. He lost his friends. In the end, one of the last to leave was Auguste Renoir. And the final years of his life, he was nearly blind. He used to restlessly wander the streets of Paris. But by this time, his fame was growing. So as his vision was failing, he was becoming more and more famous, but it gave him little comfort. This is Blue Dancers, a famous pastel drawing. One of the last, 1897, we see 4 ballerinas in vibrant blue and lavender costumes, a masterpiece from his late career, noted for its rich colours, capturing the dancers in a backstage moment rather than during a performance. His eyesight was very poor at this stage, and because of his vision problems, he began to work in broader, less detailed strokes and large blocks of colour, which gave priority to this overall decorative composition. And as was common in his later work, he used pastels because the medium allowed him to explore the balance between painting and drawing. He created this luminous, textured quality that perfectly captures the dancers' diaphanous tutus and the stage lighting. It was shortly after the Dreyfus affair, which I'll mention at this point, that broke in 1894. It was a political scandal that wasn't resolved until 1906, and it divided the French Republic. Alfred Dreyfus who was Jewish, was wrongly convicted of treason for supplying French military secrets to the Germans. And the Dreyfus affair brought out anti-Semitism in France, and it brought out Degas' anti-Semitism, and it caused him to break with his Jewish friends. Now later, the real culprit, Dreyfus was completely innocent, the real culprit was found. The army had forged evidence in order to try Dreyfus. That was exposed. And all of this came to symbolise modern miscarriages of justice and widespread anti-Semitism. In 1911, he attended a retrospective of Ingres' work. His sight had failed, so he would trace the canvases with his hands in order to, quote, see them, demonstrating the lasting significance of his early meeting with Ingres in 1855. By the last years, he was nearly blind. He had a degenerative eye condition. He largely ceased producing art. His long-time home and studio was demolished in 1912. He moved to new quarters in the Boulevard de Clichy, and he became increasingly reclusive. As I said, he was estranged from most of his friends. One painter who did remain in contact was Méry Cassatt. He died in Paris on September the 27th, 1917, at the age of 83. The cause of death is believed to have been a brain aneurysm. Now, during his lifetime, I remember he sold the inherited art collection to pay off his brother's debts. He continued to collect art. He was an avid art collector. He amassed a remarkable collection of work in his lifetime, and after his death his collection was sold at auction in 1918, and it reveals his passion for the artists he loved, Ingres, Delacroix, Daumier, as well as his support for contemporaries like Manet and Mary Cassatt, his friend. He requested his funeral to be simple and a quiet affair with no speeches. He was buried in the family tomb at Montmartre Cemetery in Paris. His friend, the painter Jean-Louis Forain, reportedly delivered the only eulogy, simply stating, "If there were speeches, you know that the first would be from me, but it's better this way." So, Degas has been described as a misogynist, a racist, an anti-Semite, for reasons that I've outlined. He was also, of course, the most innovative and complex of artists. He was an important link between the classical tradition, artists like Ingres, and modern art. He possessed superb draftsmanship, which he applied in innovative ways to modern subjects. And unlike other Impressionist painters, as I said, he refused to call himself an Impressionist. He focused primarily on line rather than colour and light. His exacting and experimental approach to drawing influenced artists like Picasso and Matisse, who admired his ability to capture the body, particularly the body in motion. That brings me to the end of this talk. Thank you for your time and attention, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Goodbye for now.